course, Min has written an excellent book on that very subject as well. So I've been asked to talk about the BRI and the geopolitical contestation that has produced over development financing and the implications of that for the global south. And I suppose it's all been a bit doom and gloom tonight. So that's tonight where I am, this afternoon where most of you are. So I suppose actually I want to offer a bit more of a not rosy, but less gloomy conclusion. And what I want to say is, can be quite controversial, I suppose, but I'm going to have to be relatively assertive about it and just state what I think. And if people want to challenge me, they can do so in Q&A. So there are four main points I want to make. The first is that the origins of the BRI are largely unrelated to great power competition, but are largely economic in nature. So I have written about this elsewhere with Jinghang Zheng and Shahar Hamiri. In my view, the BRI was not primarily about geostrategic competition. It is primarily a geospatial fix to deep-seated problems within the Chinese economy. The main objective is to externalize surplus capacity and capital through offering loans and securing overseas projects to keep the state-owned sector going, which is mired in debt and surplus capacity. The potential political benefits of this are to some extent a sort of added bonus, kind of win-win, if you like, as the Chinese like to put it. Secondly, the operations of the BRI, the way that BRI decision-making actually works, is also largely unstrategic. And again, I've written about this with Jinghang, and also there's a chapter on this, how it actually works, in my new book, Fractured China. The main argument that we have made is, and we're not only making this, is that the Chinese development financing regime, the institutional framework within China, is not geared towards dispensing development financing for geostrategic purposes. It is highly fragmented, and projects are not designed or placed by strategic planners in Beijing according to some kind of detailed blueprint or even an official map of where they want things to go. There is no official map of the BRI, and unofficial ones were banned in 2017. The truth is that Chinese development financing is recipient-led. So would-be recipient governments that are often egged on by Chinese state-owned enterprises prospecting for overseas businesses, they apply to Beijing for projects that they want. And then the two sides bargain over what they will finance, which state-owned enterprises are going to do it, et cetera, et cetera. So the BRI is consequently piecemeal. It's scattered, it's bottom up. It doesn't really add up to a coherent whole, and it certainly doesn't correspond to some detailed top-down plan that has been drawn up in Beijing. The third point is that nonetheless, the BRI does have geostrategic implications. If it doesn't have geostrategic causes, it nonetheless has geostrategic implications for two reasons. The first is that when things go well, which it doesn't always go well, for reasons I've just given, that it's very spotty and poorly governed, when it goes well, recipients have strengthened ties with China and they gain leverage against other states. So to take just one very small example, if you look at Cambodia, the BRI projects there, the Chinese projects there, are not well coordinated. They are quite ad hoc and fragmented. If you actually trace the origins of them, they don't emerge from some kind of strategic plan. But it is nonetheless the case that Chinese investment in Cambodia has greatly strengthened the Cambodian People's Party regime because it has fed its patronage network, and it has often come bundled with military aid, which strengthens a key component of the ruling coalition in Cambodia. And in exchange, Cambodia has clearly acted as a Chinese proxy in ASEAN discussions of the South China Sea, which has undermined its already very weak collective action there. And that help from China has also emboldened the CPP regime to risk its ties with the United States and EU, which have cut aid and imposed sanctions over the CPP's authoritarian domestic practices. So you can see that these things have consequences for the way that other actors will behave. And the second reason why the BRI has strategic implications is that other major powers react to the BRI as if it is a geostrategic offensive. So I can write all the articles in the world telling you that it's not. But if the people that actually make foreign policy don't believe me, don't listen to me, then to them they see it through the lens of realism. So they have seen this as a threat, as something to compete with. And so they warn off recipients and say, don't buy in for this. This is a Chinese plot. It's debt trap diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera. And what we have seen over time is China's rivals have launched rival development financing facilities, or they've boosted existing ones in order to compete with China. So from Japan, we saw the Quality Infrastructure Initiative in 2015. From the United States, the Development Finance Corporation in 2018 and Build Back Better World last year. Australia launched its infrastructure financing facility for the Pacific in 2019. The G20 set out principles for quality infrastructure investment in the same year. And the United States, Japan, and Australia set out the Blue Dot Network to implement the G20 principle in 2019 also. The UK has stuck its oar in with British International Investment, launched last year, and the EU belatedly launched its Global Gateway Initiative. So development financing, after being an area that has been dominated by the West for a long time, the rise of China as a provider has sparked fresh geopolitical contestation in this area. And fourthly, and this is where the sort of slightly rosier perspective comes in, is that insofar as this competition does not escalate into conflict, it doesn't escalate into pressure on developing countries to take sides decisively and balance against China, it's arguably beneficial for developing countries for two reasons. So first of all, it forces China to improve the quality and the governance of the Belt and Road Initiative. As Min mentioned, China has been very sensitive to debt trap diplomacy accusations, notably at the 2019 Belt and Road Forum. So Xi Jinping promised better quality projects and a clean and green Belt and Road. The Ministry of Commerce and other regulatory agencies have tightened regulations to try to prevent the sorts of corruption and white elephant projects that have been emerging around the world. The Commission for Discipline Inspection has dispatched agents to some troubled projects, for example, in Laos, to try to curb corruption. The second reason it could benefit developing countries is that it provides more choice and leverage to developing country governments. So recipients may now feel more alert to the risks of BRI projects and more emboldened and encouraged to scrutinize proposed projects and to bargain harder, whereas in the past, they may have felt that they basically had no choice but just to take the terms being offered by Chinese enterprises. They may also be able to access better technical support in order to evaluate prospective projects for the likely return and make more sensible choices for themselves. And they may have more choice among providers. So I do think that China and in East Asia, Japan, will likely remain the dominant providers for the foreseeable future, because the basic model of development and financing that the West is still pushing is still limited by neoliberal modalities. But I think those things, as long as competition between China and the West does not escalate into outright conflict, then this could potentially be somewhat beneficial for developing countries. I don't really think that the correlation of forces has moved decisively against the United States, in the sense that if you really want to count up the number of firm allies that say Russia or China have, then they're not many. If you look at Southeast Asia, for example, which is China's backyard, then you'd have to say kind of Laos and Cambodia are maybe the main allies, and these are tiny, really kind of geostrategically irrelevant countries. The rest of the countries in the region, if they were really pushed, they don't want to pushed, but if you really did push them, they would side with the United States. And I don't think that's that different with Russia. I think I very much agree with what Konstantin says. The position that the Russian regime finds itself in is a position of weakness, geopolitical weakness. Russia is economically weak, militarily weak. So it's not so much the balance that the constellation of forces really moved against the United States, it's that the United States has shot itself in the face So the problem is that the West, enjoying a position of US hegemony and unipolarity after the Cold War, abandoned any sense of self-restraint, abandoned the basic rules of diplomacy, which involve reckoning with the interests of other powerful states and conceding certain things to them, and recklessly blundered around the world, engaging in, as Michael says, the forever wars. It's the United States that has been the biggest revisionist power in the world over the last 30 years. And it's the one that has violated fundamental norms of international order, notably the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, by rampaging around in the name first of human rights and then the war on terror. And it's that has massively destabilized the Middle East and North Africa and created openings for the kinds of proxy wars that we've seen in Syria. And I think, as Konstantin said, it's the expansion of NATO and to a secondary degree the EU into the Russian borderlands that has provoked a reaction from Moscow. And nobody should be surprised by that, because the moment that these things were put on the agenda, Moscow immediately reacted and said, you really shouldn't do this. We regard this as a threat to our security. And this is where basic failings of international diplomacy comes to the fore. It has not been, the West has not seen any reason to compromise with Russia. And it, I think, has therefore blundered into conflict. What would be so bad about creating a demilitarized buffer zone between NATO and Russia? What would be so bad about Finlandization for countries like Georgia and Ukraine? Finland's not a bad place to be. That's the way I think to get stability in that region. And I think Konstantin's right that the EU and NATO don't feel like they can step down, but there's a reason for that, which is that they've lost the ability to reckon with the interests of other powerful states. They're not thinking strategically. They're not thinking through the traditional lens of strategy, about thinking about balance and compromise and concert and things like that. They are still thinking in very warped terms, informed by liberal ideology. So I think that has to be constantly borne in mind, that these countries still conceive of themselves as being weak. In Russia's case, it is weak. And China thinks of itself as a developing country, which in many respects it still is, and one that is surrounded by American military bases and allies. And it sees the United States as vehemently opposed to Chinese development and the restoration of what China's current government thinks is its rightful place in the world, again, as a great power. And that's its historical role. But it is convinced that the United States will not allow that to happen. And the United States is proving that they are right.